Hi kids, welcome to our next lesson on Elisha, the prophet of God. How we're going to start today is we're going to start with a review game. Alright, so how we're going to do this is I'm going to ask you guys a question. Specifically, I'm going to ask you 7 questions from each of the 7 lessons that we've learned about so far about Elisha. Okay, so I'm going to ask you the question, I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about it, and then you guys can go ahead and say your answer out loud, or at least get it in your head. And then I'm going to give you guys the correct answer. Okay, so are you guys ready for this review game? All right, let's start with our first question. Who did Elisha follow and get trained by before he was a prophet? Who did Elisha follow and get trained by before he was a prophet? You have your answer? The correct answer is Elijah. Remember, they have very similar names, and I gave you a trick that first week to remember their names and to remember where they are in the Bible story. Here's Elijah's name. Pay attention, he has a J in his name, and Elisha has an S in his name. And I gave you the trick to remember that Elijah comes before Elisha in the Bible story, that Elijah is Elisha's master, by remembering that J comes before S in the alphabet, just as Elijah comes before Elisha. All right, so that's our first question. Our second question is a tough one. All right, so get ready for it. I'd like you to tell me 2 things that happened on the day that Elisha became a prophet of God and took over for Elisha. 2 things. I'll give you options of what you could have said. Okay, something you could have mentioned is that Elisha continued to follow Elijah even though Elijah told him to stay behind. Maybe a second and third thing you could have said is that God divided the Jordan River by Elijah and Elisha. He did that for both of them. Here's a picture of when it divided for Elijah. That's kind of a second and third thing you could have said. A fourth thing you could have said is that Elijah was brought up to heaven in a whirlwind with fiery chariots and horses going with him. And the last thing you could have mentioned is that when Elijah goes up to heaven, the prophets come to Elisha and they want to search to try and find Elijah. Elisha knows that they won't find him, but they want to. Okay, that's something else you could have said. So any of those would have been options for the 2 things that you had to mention that happened on the same day that Elisha became the prophet of God. Here's our third question. What 2 women did God provide for through Elisha? The answer is the poor widow and the rich Shunammite. Next, what happened after Naaman was healed of his leprosy? What happened afterwards? The answer is Naaman placed his faith in God. In our 5th lesson, we actually met Elisha. Okay, that was pretty fun to talk with Elisha. Here's our question from that lesson. Name one of the 5 miracles that Elisha told us about that week. Just name one of them. Here's the 5 miracles, so hopefully you got at least one. He healed deadly water. He called bears to attack boys who dishonored God. He provided bread for many out of just a few loaves. He healed deadly water, and he retrieved an axe head that had fallen into water. So hopefully you got at least one of those. Next, we learned about God's protection. You remember Elisha was so close to getting captured by the Syrian king. Here's our question from that week. What did God send to show his protection for Elisha? Give you a hint. Remember what surrounded the Syrian army when it came up to Elisha's city. Here's the answer. An army of fiery horses and chariots. Okay, that is the correct answer. Our last question comes from last week's lesson. Remember, we talked with the king and the leper. Again, that was pretty fun to go back in time to meet those 2. Here's our question from that lesson. What did we learn about God's promises? Remember, God provided for the people in a famine. What do we learn about his promises? I'll give you 3 options. The first is that God always fulfills his promises. The second option is that God sometimes fulfills his promises. And the third option is God never fulfills his promises. Is it always, sometimes, or never? The correct answer is that God always fulfills his promises. That's the lesson we learned from that week. So how did you guys do? Did you get all 7 correct? That would be pretty good. But if you got just a few of them, I can tell you guys have been paying attention in these lessons on Elisha. And hopefully, even more importantly than learning about Elisha, hopefully you've learned a lot about God and what our relationship to God should look like from these lessons. So let's move on to our story today. What we're going to be looking at is 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. So you can turn there in your Bibles with me, 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 1 through 6, and in just a little bit, we're going to be reading some of those verses. And as I mentioned, just 6 verses, so it's kind of a shorter story, but there's a lot packed into this story. Before we look at the story, I want to introduce to you the characters that we have in this story. And actually, we have 2 characters that we've already learned about, and actually one of them we already met. The first character that we are going to see in this story is the rich Shunammite. Remember, we met her, we talked about her and learned about her, how God provided through Elisha in several ways for her. Well, she's going to be in our story again today. And the other person is none other than Gehazi. You remember who Gehazi is? He's a servant of Elisha, but he also got leprosy as punishment for his selfishness. Both of those characters are in our story today. So our story begins actually in the past. Okay, it begins in the past. As we're going to see, we kind of get some background. Okay, so we see it begins in the past, and then it will move to the present. All right, so let's see what happens in this story. So we find in the beginning of the story, as I said, in the past, we're told that Elisha at some point had warned the rich Shunammite that a famine was coming for 7 years. Remember what a famine is? It's when food and water are running out in a city or in a land, and Elisha not only warns her, but he actually tells her to go find protection or go find another place to live where you will have food and water. Elisha was showing his care. He was showing his kindness for this woman and her family. And we see in this story that the rich Shunammite, she obeyed, and she took her family to live in a different land. You might be thinking, what's the big deal that she obeyed? Okay, what's so important about the fact that she obeyed Elisha? Well, I'll give you 2 reasons. The first reason is that the famine probably didn't start to happen at this point. She would have had to trust Elisha. She wouldn't have been able to see food running out or water running out at this point. She would have had to trust the words of Elisha. And the second reason, maybe you guys can relate to, she had to move. Have you guys ever moved in your life? When you move, oftentimes you're leaving friends. You're even maybe sometimes leaving family that you lived around. You're possibly switching schools. So things are changing a lot for you, and you're leaving behind those that you loved, and you're just not going to get to see them as much as you once did. Well, that's what's going on for the rich Shunammite. This would have been a very hard thing to do for her to leave her people and go live in a foreign land. As we see, she actually moves to enemy territory. She moves to the land of the Philistines. And amazingly, she's safe there. Okay, they don't attack her because she's enemy, but she's protected there. And we aren't told too much about that time, but it seems as if she lived very peacefully there. So we see she lives there for 7 years, and after the 7 years, the famine is up. She goes to move back to her house and her land. But she finds someone is already living in her house and her land. Someone had taken her house and her land as their own. So I'll ask you guys, kids, what do you think she does? Where do you think she's going to go live? Where can she live? Is she going to go back to the land of the Philistines? We find in this story that she goes to the king and she asks him for her house and her land back. So this is now where our story goes from the past and moves to the present. Okay? Goes from the past and moves to the present. Okay? So we find out we're going to find out what's going to happen to the rich Shunammite. So turn in your Bibles to 2 Kings 8, and we're going to read verses 4 through 5 to see where this story picks up in the present. This is what it says in verse 4. Now the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. So that's where Gehazi comes in, the servant of Elisha, saying, "Tell me all the great things that Elisha has done." And while he was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life appealed to the king for her house and her land. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, here is the woman, and here is her son, whom Elisha restored to life." So the rich Shunammite goes to the king, and none other than Elisha's servant is there. Not some random person. The king isn't alone, but he's with none other than Elisha's servant, Gehazi. Also, amazingly, the king and Gehazi aren't just talking about random things, but they're talking about Elisha, and even more so, they're talking about the miracles that he did for the rich Shunammite. So she walks in to this scene, and some might ask, what are the chances? They might ask, how can this be? Is this just by accident? And my answer to them would be no. This isn't by accident. This isn't just luck that she walks in and there's Gehazi. They're talking about her and Elisha. But this is God who set this up. God set this up to ultimately provide for the rich Shunammite, as we're going to find out very soon. So the story goes on in verse 6. In verse 6 it says, "And when the king asked the woman, she told him, so the king appointed an official for her, saying, 'Restore all that was hers, together with all the produce of the fields, from the day that she left the land until now.' So she goes back for her house and her land, and the king gives it to her. But he gives her something unexpected as well. He gives her all of the food that she would have gotten if she would have stayed in the land. So he provides for her in amazing and unexpected ways. So that's where we'll end our story for today. So let's think now. Let's think about, what does this story teach us about God and our relationship to him? Got two lessons for you. The first lesson is, I'd say, the main lesson, the main takeaway from this story. And it's this, that God provides. That God provides. God provided for the rich Shunammite in so many ways. Think about it. I'll list off 5 ways that God provided for the rich Shunammite in this story. The first way is that God provided by warning her through Elisha of this famine that was coming. Okay, he provided for her by this warning. The second way is he provided safety for her in enemy territory. The third way is that God provided by having Gehazi there with the king. The fourth way is God provided by having the king asking about Elisha and finding out about her through Gehazi. And the fifth way, God provided through the king by giving her her house and her land and even a ton of food to the rich Shunammite. That is a lot of ways that God provided in this one story in just 6 verses. God provided in these 5 ways for the rich Shunammite. These things could have looked like accidents. They could have looked like luck or chance, but no, these were things God provided on purpose for the rich Shunammite. So I want you guys to think about it. How does God provide for you? I hope you start making a list. God provides for you in ways that might seem simple, or things you just don't think about too often. He gives you your food and your drink each and every day. God gives you your families and your friends. God gives you your clothing that you wear and your toys that you have. God even gives you safety when you ride in the car. These are all things that God provides for you. So I want to encourage you guys, after this lesson, to start making a list. You could either think about it or get out a piece of paper and write down 5 things or 10 things or more of things that God provides for you on a daily basis, or even things that he's provided for you in the past. And then stop. After you make this list, stop and pray to him, saying, and thank God for the things that he's provided for you. That's the first lesson from our story today. The second lesson deals with the king. The king asked Gehazi, tell me all the things that Elisha has done. Tell me the great things that Elisha has done. And he did. And we even see the rich Shunammite told him some of these things. But the point I want to make here is that the king is hearing these things and even being amazed by these things, but they didn't make a difference in his life. The king was a sinful man. He didn't follow God. Hearing these stories impressed him, but they didn't change him. They entertained him, but they didn't lead him to obey God. Kids, you may be sitting here and you may enjoy learning these lessons about these Bible stories. You might enjoy doing the review games, and you might enjoy when some really cool things happen in these Bible stories. But if these stories are just entertainment for you, and they aren't helping you to grow in your relationship with God, then you're totally missing the point. The king didn't have a relationship with God. He rejected him. He didn't follow him. These stories were just entertainment for him. So the question I have for you kids is, are these stories just entertainment for you? Or are they helping to change you to follow God better, to live a life that is pleasing and honoring to him? So we learned from this story today to be thankful for the ways that God provides for us in so many ways. And we also learn that God's stories in the Bible, that these things that we learn about him and others in the story shouldn't just be entertainment, but they should change us to live a life that is pleasing and honoring to him. So that's all that I have for you guys today. I hope you guys have a good week.